No, this is for the tape. You might want to put this on, Dale, when you're done. This mic, by the way, isn't for amplifying. It's for the videotape. So if you have trouble hearing me, just kind of start waving your hand up there. First of all, I want to thank Bill Webster for this whole idea behind the Frontier Forum. We've been doing it for many years now, and I really like the idea behind it. This is the first time I've ever addressed the forum, but I like the idea of trying to mix and cross boundaries and have some fertile consequences come out of that. And I also want to thank the Frontier Forum Committee for selecting my proposal, and also for Dale Peterson, Chairman of the Economics Department, for agreeing to be discussant to this. In fact, I was talking to him just previous to the talk here, and feeling a little guilty because I dumped my last edition of my book on him, and he only had a few weeks to read it. And I also want to thank all of you for coming too, especially on a hot day like this. A couple things before I start. My remarks are going to be very general. I'm doing this because I got a lot of information in the book. Dale might be commenting on specific things in the book that I'm not going to cover in a general way, but I'm going to try to hit the highlights of what I said in the book rather than going into a great detail. And the other thing I want to mention, in case you might not have noticed it yet, I have to admit that public speaking is not my forte. Much like other people, this is an anxiety-provoking situation. So I'm going to do my best in a situation that I'm not really used to. I'm used to being in a class, but somehow that's different. Before my peers and colleagues, it's a real different matter. But I really felt the need to do this. Because I think the problem is very serious, and I think we better start talking about this. I agree with you, Rosemary. I think this is going to be an incredible issue for the 90s and perhaps beyond, because there has been a very definite increase in income inequality, not only in the United States but around the world, and the two are related. One last thing before I get started, I might as well at least plug my book a little bit. It will be out in August. It's coming out by Nelson Hall out of Chicago. So it should be available after that point. I think we could begin by even asking why would we want to even study income inequality. And I listed a number of factors that popped up in my review of the literature. One, probably the most important, would be a shrinking middle class, which would destroy the American way of life. There's a lot of people that believe this, including myself. I think a middle class is a buttress to democracy. If you have an educated, participating, aware electorate, you will have preservation of democracy, and also perhaps a lack of class conflict. The differences, the extreme gaps will be less evident, etc. The second one, I don't think is going to go over too much with academics, because obviously we're here and we're not making big bucks in corporations. So consumer spending is not a big item for us. Our salaries, they're important, but they're not something that perhaps other workers would really see as affluent, that's for sure. Barbara Ehrenreich has this idea that a declining consumer base is actually going to result in some great dissatisfaction in our country. And she contends that when people can't get the goodies any longer, or have to even contend with shoddy goods, Kmart type goods, when the rich people are buying stuff from Saks or Dayton's or whatever, there's going to be a growth in alienation between the haves and the have-nots. There's a lot of research that's come out recently that shows that The more income inequality we get, the more of a threat to democracy comes about. Regime repressiveness, killings, disappearances, torture, coups all increase as income inequality increases. And by the way, that holds irrespective of the degree of income. In other words, you can have high income and have a high degree of income inequality as well. I'll explain those differences as I go along. And then lastly, well, not quite lastly, deteriorating family life. I don't really have to go into that in great detail. We have all kinds of evidence coming about, but just to highlight, there's the feminization of poverty that's become an issue during the 80s in particular. Increasing divorce. One of our research studies shows that on the average, women who get divorced lose 72% of their income. You know, just overnight, you know, where males gain 42% of their income. More family workers, more family members who are working, less leisure, etc. So all of this can follow a loss of income and declining absolute income. Lastly, there's an interesting couple books out by Batra. His latest is The Great Depression of 1990. A lot of his writing makes sense to me anyway, and it shows that as income concentrates among the very rich, we get to be very unstable in the country and get to be very much more open and vulnerable to economic disaster, meltdowns, like we had in 1987 and maybe even last fall on the stock market. So that depression can threaten. So those are a number of different reasons why income inequality is important to study. I wanted to also begin by talking about teachers' salaries. I wanted to contrast us to, and whoever else, you know, to the real wealthy in our country, which happens to be chief executive officers of large corporations. These are the top paid U.S. CEOs in 1987. And that's $60 million, folks, up there on the top by Charles Lazarus. This is his total compensation. That includes his salary, bonus, stock gains, etc. Lee Iacocca, who does all these ads about, you know, being just an average Joe, you know, I figured out what his hourly salary is, you know, assuming he works 40 hours a week and makes, what does he make, about 18 million a year, 17.5 million. That comes to over $9,000 a year, or an hour. So he's making literally in half a day what most of us make all year long. The rewards are very high. During that year, by the way, that was the year of the stock market crash, if you recall. The top executives boosted their pay. The 800 top executives, it climbed 8%. So 273 earned over $1 million in that year. 762,000 was the average. Most of these are the invisible rich. Most of them we don't know who they are. Thanks to one movie, we probably all know who the chairman of General Motors is, and that's Roger Smith. If you haven't seen Roger and Me, go see it. It's an excellent movie. Lastly, before I move on, Fortune magazine did a study of chief executive pay and found that only a third of the pay was tied to the profit records of these executives in their corporations. The rest was irrational criteria. American chief executive officers were vastly overpaid in comparison to other nations. With a to give you an example, you know, in comparison to other countries, for billion-dollar companies, the chief executive officer gets $983,000 on the average in the U.S. In Germany, $403,000, and in Japan, $330,000. So we're, I think, overpaying our executives to begin with. While a European chief executive officer typically makes 7 times more than the entry level of a professional employee, it's 14 to 1 in the United States. So the inequality starts right in the corporate office to begin with. And one of the things I was impressed with in doing this research is that some of the their own business organizations or business publications like Fortune and Wall Street Journal and stuff point these inequities out. So they're not shy about, pointing to some of their, downfalls as well. How do we get to income inequality throughout the world? I just briefly wanted to go through what's in great vogue today. It's called modern world systems theory in sociology. This was developed by Emanuel Wallerstein, and it was developed from a historical base. Essentially, they posit that there's one world economy with separate nations and governments, but there's a global division of labor. I don't think we'll have any disagreement with that. Capitalists, everybody agrees that we're becoming more of a global economy as time goes along. They developed this historically, though, and they said that this process really started about the 16th century with Dutch trade. The Dutch were the first top hegemonic power, and then followed by the British later on. And then in this century, particularly after World War II, the United States became the predominant hegemonic power. At any rate, there's only a few rich core countries in this theory that dominate all the other poor countries, which are called the periphery. And I'm going to give you a rundown on who's where. And then there's some that fall in between that are not completely subjugated and that have some room to maneuver and perhaps get out from, being unduly influenced or badly influenced by core countries. Unequal trade, this is where the influence comes from, the bad influence. Unequal trade exists between poor and rich nations. Over and over again, I've seen that core countries export higher priced manufacturing goods. They import cheap raw materials. There's a new theory out called the new dependency, which is saying, well, third world countries are increasingly manufacturing, but it doesn't seem to matter because there's so much power and profit in the core countries that they get to dictate the prices when they're selling stuff, and they get to dictate the prices when they're buying commodities from the third world. That's where the unequal trade advantage comes. The economic power of core nations allows them to set prices. I just said that. So periphery nations are locked into never-ending poverty. Coercion, force, outlawing unions, military repression. This is all part of the general package in the third world, all used by their own governments, by the way, to create a docile, low-paid labor force for oftentimes core multinational corporations who insist on low wages. New plants are located in periphery countries by core firms, and in essence, this is why a lot of times we have very right-wing paramilitary types of regimes in power, because they do keep things at a very docile level. And once in a while, a CIA coup or Contras. Well, this gives you a rundown here of the core countries, and I also listed the gross national product, GNP per person, of core countries. This is the latest data I had, which, by the way, comes from the World Bank. They're very good about sharing their data. If you look at that, core countries are not only wealthy, they have an average of about $11,500, but the other thing that's very remarkable is that they're almost all European, with the exception of the United States, and Canada's in here somewhere. Japan is the only Asian one here, and the only East Bloc one we really have is Yugoslavia as well, which happens to be the poorest one. I'm going to tell you in a minute here how they divide up core, semi-periphery, and periphery countries. But you'll notice that there's a fairly wide range of income. On the average, they're wealthy, but there's a few that aren't too wealthy, and there's some that are very wealthy. The United States GNP per person is still fairly well off. That doesn't, mean a lot, though, when I get into talking about internal factors, which I'll come to. The semi-periphery are people or nations in the middle. Again, the group average is significantly lower, 2,545, and again, they go from 200 up to 12,160. So there's a tremendous income difference here. And lastly, I'll list the periphery for you. Okay, again, you have a fairly large difference between the top and the bottom, but again, on the average, they're fairly poor, and they're more poor than the semi-periphery. I forgot what the, yeah, 2,500 versus 1,500 here. How are they rated? Well, Snyder and Kick did a research paper, and they used a number of criteria here. One was the balance of trade, essentially. So it was imports minus exports to rank. That was the only economic criteria they used. The other three were military adventures or occupations of other countries was a second one. Forgetting, diplomatic postings was the third one. I'm forgetting the fourth one. It's here in my notes somewhere. Steve, you recall? All right, I'll get to it. Anyway, the point is, oh yeah, military, or I'm sorry, trade alliances, being involved in trade alliances. So you had military occupation, trade alliances, diplomatic postings, and the economic trade factor there to rate these countries. Here's what the global income picture looks like worldwide. This is, you can see some huge differences, and you can see that it's essentially a north-south difference here. The very wealthy countries are, of course, Europe and the United States, Canada, a couple others thrown in, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, etc., and a couple Middle Eastern countries, which are major exceptions to this whole north-south pattern. Global inequality is very lopsided, and at the top, the richest 1% of income recipients in the world get 15% of all the income. The poorest 20% of all income recipients get only 1% of all income. In other words, if you ranked all the income recipients from 0 up to 100% and the money they get, what I'm saying here is the top 1% of income recipients get 15% of all the money. The bottom 20% get only 1% of all income. The evidence shows that when China is seen as only one nation among many of these countries instead of weighting its population, the core nations increase their GNP faster than the periphery. This is GNP per person or per capita. Absolute income differences have grown larger as well. The absolute income difference between core countries and periphery countries doubled between 1950 and 1975 in terms of real dollars, you know, after you subtract inflation and stuff. Much of this was done by favorable trade conditions, as I mentioned before, multinationals, core countries getting to set the price, whether they're selling or buying, and also when world economy contracts, again, the periphery countries are in a position where they can't do much about it other than suffer. Core countries simply will stop buying or start making some of their own products. To prove my point here, according to the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, the GATT figures, the share of world trade for poor, less developed countries declined in just 6 years. It went from 28% down to 19%. So we have been, a lot of people don't know it, but we've been in a global depression, I would say. Definitely a global recession. We've been pretty much insulated from it here in the United States. So unless we, you know, are hooked into the world press for whatever reason, or are interested in Latin American countries or something, a lot of times it's invisible to us. I know some of the economists are going to recognize this figure here. This is beginning to show you how we could look at income inequality in a relative sense. I've been talking about GNP per person, absolute income differences, etc. Those are real dollars. There's a way of looking at it in terms of relative income inequality or dispersion as well. If, remember I talked about ranking all the families that received income up to 100%. and found out what percent of all the income they get. If you had a perfectly equal society, 20% of families would get 20% of all the income. 40% of families would get 40% of all the income. 60% of families would get 60% of all the income. That diagonal is an example of a perfectly egalitarian society. They don't exist in reality. In all societies, all countries differ in varying degrees from that. And how they differ is what we're really interested in. We can plot that too. So this is for U.S. families as of 1986. And I looked at, for the bottom 20% of all families, they got about something like 4% of all the income. It's real hard to read from this graph, but you get the point. The bottom 40% of all the families got something like 16% of all the income. The 60% of families, bottom 60%, got something like 28% of all the income. So we're graphing along here. Okay? The bulge from the line of perfect equality indicates how bad the inequality is in a country. And of course, the greater the bulge, the worse the income inequality. Well, you can compare countries or states or whatever on this basis, but it's still pretty awkward. You can't be looking at a whole bunch of Lorenz curves. This is what it's called, a Lorenz curve. So an economist came along by the name of Gini and invented his ratio, which is simply taking this area right here and dividing it by the area in the ABC section here in this triangle to give you a single ratio, a single number. And that ratio varies from 1, which means perfect inequality, down to 0, which means perfect equality in a country. Now the numbers in actuality can vary from probably some of the lowest I can ever remember seeing is about 0.28, and the highest in my data is about 0.59 or 0.60. That's for Brazil, which is the most inegalitarian of all the countries I looked at. So it gives you a relative picture about how bad income is dispersed or how much inequality exists in a country. Now that's kind of a long explanation, but it's worth going through because it can show you at a glance essentially who's worse off than who else. And just looking at core countries, for example, I worked out Gini scores for them. The Netherlands, of all the recorded data anyway, shows the least inequality. The lower the score again, the less inequality there is, relative inequality in a country. So the Netherlands had the best. Japan was fairly low, etc. And if you go down the line here, the United States, we didn't do too badly, but we're in about the third of most equal countries in the world. And among the core countries, though, we're not really that equal. There's a lot more core countries that have better distributions of income than we do. One thing, too, to notice that we are the most chintzy, I guess, with our lowest 20% of income recipients. If you notice, the United States has only 5.3% of our income going to the poorest 20% of our population. And all the other countries are higher than that. So, again, it's all relative at this point. It's all in different perspectives. Certainly, we're better off, though, than the third world. And just going to semi-periphery, by the way, the average Gini score, you should know this for those of you probably taking notes, the average Gini score for core countries is 0.32. So the United States was 0.3359. We're fairly close. We're, by the way, 26% above, though, the lowest of all Gini scores, which was the Netherlands. The average Gini score for the semi-periphery is 0.42. And as we go to poorer countries, the relative distribution gets much worse as well. I should also mention here that for all three areas, core, periphery, semi-periphery, there are statistically significant differences between all three areas on the Gini scores. Okay. And then lastly, core countries. I'm sorry, periphery countries. 0.48 is their average. The bottom line here, what I'm trying to get to, is that as a country becomes poorer in real income, as absolute income goes down, as measured by GNP per person, the relative income dispersion also gets worse. So it's almost like adding insult to injury. It makes things even worse. So you get a country with a GNP level of $500 or less, which is getting down into the poor range. The poor, the very poorest of that population, I don't see how they survive. In fact, they don't. A lot of them don't. The poor, in other words, in these countries are worse off than the poor in the core, which are both relatively well off and well off in real income dollars as well. Brazil has the world's worst recorded Gini score of about 0.60. This is one of the reasons Kathy and I went to visit Brazil in a year ago last January when we were on sabbatical. There's a lot of stories we could tell you about. One of them, though, we came face to face with third world poverty in a real interesting way. We were mugged the third night there, right on Copacabana Beach, you know, and we're very lucky we escaped with just the loss of a few dollars, and our dignity was stolen as well, but nothing else. I think our reaction to that was, though, after seeing what was going on there, we couldn't really blame the people because they're really just trying to survive, and it comes right down to that, too. I've never seen poverty like that. Well, how do we do it? How does the core preserve its advantage over poor countries? Much of this is done by the leverage of corporations which enter less developed countries and control the local power structure, the politics, and the economic situation there. This is where we get the term banana republics. This literally comes from Guatemala, which, if you know your history, we overthrew a democratically elected government in 1954 through a CIA coup. We overthrew because of the United Fruit Company. The elected government had nationalized the United Fruit Company holdings there. We're paying them off, but nonetheless we did that. These are things that happen all too typically at different times in the third world. To give you an idea how much we're involved in direct investment, at the start of 1988, U.S. direct investment abroad stood at $309 billion. This is 26 times what it was in 1950 and 1/3 as much as 1984. So, and this is in 4 years that we had increased our holdings, direct investment abroad. In 4 straight short years we had done that. By the 1980s, foreign production of U.S. multinationals was 4 times as large as American exports. In many ways, our expansion was dramatic and unparalleled until 1985, and at that time, Japan surged forward to challenge our supremacy in this area. Japan does it too, and we're seeing some other areas. South Korea is starting to do it. There's a few other areas, but for the most part, it's the core countries, Japan, Europe, the United States, that have been doing this. There's no disagreement with this. Capitalism does have an insatiable thirst for profits. Marxists maintain that. Capitalist defendants maintain that, etc. It's a very expansionary energetic type of system. Core firms cut a deal with elites in poor countries. These leaders will guarantee a low-wage, union-free labor force, and therefore they'll come in with their dollars and start up plants. A lot of times they don't even come in with their dollars. They get concessions, they get loans from the third world, etc., because they are chasing a rainbow of hopefully higher wages, which never do appear. Since wages are lower in periphery countries, profits soar. More plants then flee from America to less developed countries. You've all heard of deindustrialization by now. It's a real problem in our country, and this is where a lot of it is stemming from. Anti-monopoly laws don't apply to foreign firms. So Westinghouse, for example, dominates Mitsubishi, while GE is the largest owner of Toshiba. They interact, these huge corporations in Japan and the US and elsewhere. Technology has made this also very affordable computers, satellites, stateless banking groups now make global production possible for the first time ever. Even in 1950, this had been impossible to do, but not now. We have the technology to do this. We have unchallenged dominance by the U.S. military in the world. The other aspect, and that helps keep some of these poor countries in line, the other aspect is that if the profits from these companies, foreign subsidiaries of our companies or corporations, are not repatriated, in other words, brought back to the United States, they don't have to pay income taxes. So what they've done is they've kind of rolled it over and invested more and more in some of these countries, again increasing their presence abroad. Lastly, value added gets at the use of cheap labor in foreign countries. We have laws that allow us to ship out semi-processed goods, just have labor work on them, and then ship them back in, and all they pay on that is essentially the cost of labor. Now, you may or may not think that's fair. A lot of people think it's exploitation, depending upon your situation. I'm going to give you some figures on world salaries or wages in a second. Yeah, here they are. In 1982, the average hourly wage for U.S. manufacturing workers was $12, and was much less in less developed countries. $2.43 in Brazil, Mexico $1.97, Singapore $1.77, Taiwan $1.59, South Korea $1.22, Sri Lanka 21 cents an hour. You know, we can't compete with those types of salaries. This gives you an idea of who's doing it. This is a survey of 200 of the largest multinationals. I'm sorry, I'm listing about the top 20 or 15 here. But of these largest multinationals in the U.S., 1/3 of the revenues generally come from offshore branches. So what this translates to be more graphic about this, a typical IBM PC, for example, 3/4 of the value of that is spent outside the U.S. in its manufacture. It means capital flight and deindustrialization. It means that Detroit and Flint have experienced enormous auto plant shutdowns, enormous job losses, etc., all at the same time that 7 General Motors plants and 2 Chrysler plants were opened just south of our border in Mexico. They have a 12.5-mile zone along there that's essentially a free processing zone that has almost no laws. Mexico has pretty much just pulled back and let us exploit their cheap labor there. It's called the Maquiladora Plan. Remember that, though. We're just seeing our whole industrial system moved south of the border, while people go jobless and get more poverty and go through income decline. I'll get to that in a moment too. Okay. One of the results of the march of multinational penetration in the third world from core countries is that it produces greater income inequality. This is probably the best graph I have to show this. The greater the penetration. Penetration, by the way, is measured in terms of stock ownership by Bornshire and Chase Dunn were the authors of this particular study. But the greater the stock ownership of core countries in poor countries, the greater the penetration. And as you see, as the penetration increases, so does the Gini score as well. So, well, it's claimed oftentimes that the location of these corporations is going to do real great things to the third world. Oftentimes it doesn't. It's connected with a lot of greater wealth for a few elites and a few privileged workers, but for the majority, the great bulk of workers, there's low wages. And not only that, spin-offs are actually prevented for other businesses because the multinationals insist on doing business with their other branches, So they're not encouraging spin-off feeder type businesses of the branch plants that they do locate in third world countries. Frances Moore LePay, in her book, World Hunger 12 Myths mentions that development has gone hand in hand with increasing hunger and food loss. This is agribusiness development in Brazil, Central America, Mexico, the Philippines. She presents all kinds of data to prove her point here. Okay. Who's being penetrated by whom? This gives you a penetration score here. Globally, I think you're going to see very quickly that South America is among the most penetrated of countries. That's why, again, I see this as a north-south problem. 55% of South American countries are in the top third of penetration. The U.S., by the way, is quite low on this so far anyway. This is changing fast, you know, and I have no idea what it's going to be by the year 2000. But at any rate, for now, we're doing okay. Central America is quite high in penetration, or about medium anyway, followed by Africa, which is fairly high, and Asia is not as penetrated, and neither is Europe. They're the ones that are doing the penetration essentially, and so is the U.S. There's a few major significant exceptions here. Canada is a very, very penetrated country. They're an exception to the rule. And by the way, all my research again points to the fact that, and I'm going to come to that, penetration does hurt poor countries. There's no evidence yet to indicate it hurts advanced core countries. So a country like Canada can be penetrated without dire results because it's already gone through economic development. This is.
Are the years correct on this?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, do you want to come back? That's a good point. Ask that after I'm done. That's a good point. And that's a weakness. They haven't reworked their penetration scores, and I wish they would have. Or at least update them. No. Well, we'll talk about it. This is how penetration affects the periphery. If you look here, for countries that have low penetration, their Gini ratios are actually lower, and that's good. There's more equitable distribution of income. They have a higher growth rate in GNP. They actually have more room for investing some of their domestic product in their own country versus those countries that are highly penetrated. This isn't a major exception. Exports. Highly penetrated countries are exporting more. This is no surprise. This is why they're there. These corporations are coming in to do this. But that doesn't result in good circumstances for the poor countries. And again, I'm going to show you some more details on that. And then last, a few other things, percent growth in energy used. This is often seen as an alternative measurement of development as opposed to GNP. There's more growth here in countries that are low in penetration than those that are high. Debt, look at the debt differences. There's a lot more debt in countries that are penetrated than those that aren't. Susan George has a real good book on this, A Fate Worse Than Debt, and I urge you to read it. It's a fast-moving book. It explains a lot, but she calls this the debt export treadmill. In other words, these countries borrow a lot of money to encourage these multinationals to come in, set them up, etc. They export a whole bunch, but it doesn't seem to get them ahead. You know, they suffer some more, and they get behind in paying off their debts, so they go off and they borrow some more. And it just burgeons. Brazil, I think, is probably one of the best examples of that. Okay, one last point here, a couple on the global scene, and then we'll get into the national scene here. I divided up the rich. I divided up third world countries into poorest, I guess, and richest third world countries on the basis of simply their GNP per person. And those countries with less than $730 I ranked as poor LDCs versus the rich ones. And you can see here the impact, the negative impact for poor, less developed countries is even worse. These are significant differences at 0.10. But again, the export difference, again, there's more percentage growth significantly with low penetrated countries than those that are highly penetrated. There's more debt in high penetrated countries than in low penetration, etc. And this isn't as obvious. The trends are there, but it's not as obvious in the more affluent third world countries. So the poorer the country, the more vulnerable it is to some of these more dire consequences. This is the worst part right here. How does this all translate to meeting basic human needs? You know, remember that penetration leads to higher income inequality. What does high income inequality lead to? Well, here again, I divided countries by low and high Ginies, and for countries with low Ginies, these are low inequality countries. In other words, they spend much more on housing, welfare, Social Security. There's a higher life expectancy. There are more physicians per person, or there are less persons per physician, whichever way you want to state it. They have higher proportions of the appropriate age group in secondary school. They have much lower infant mortality. They eat better. They have more food available for them. So in a nutshell, penetration, third world development by four core countries is very questionable. And particularly seeing that from the third world. You might get, say, a corporate executive from IBM arguing the other way, and I'm sure it does help IBM, but it doesn't help these other countries. I want to take a look at the United States, and there's been deterioration in the globe, in the world, on both absolute income. At least the gap is growing between poor and rich countries on absolute income, and very definitely on relative income. What's been going on in the United States? Have we benefited from this? It's our corporations that are doing this. You know, shouldn't we therefore have more money coming into the country? The answer seems to be no, and I've looked at a lot of reasons for this. To begin with, we got more competition out there. That's not telling you anything new. Japan, for example, Taiwan, South Korea, etc., West Germany. Spread of industry to less developed countries where wages are forced down results in the flight of our own corporations to the third world, and that equals job loss at home. There's real correlations between loss of manufacturing jobs and declining income. That came out very clearly in my study as well. We are addicted to imports, and that's led to huge trade deficits and dollar loss. I know they're supposed to be of higher quality. Some days I question that, but at any point, it's almost like we all have gotten to the point where we just have to have a BMW, or, you know, in certain circles, that's de rigueur. We have failed to modernize our factories and invest in needed R&D, research and development. I got some figures on that that are truly frightening. Average annual investment was 1/3 less in the 1980-85 figure than in the previous 3 decades, all of the previous 3 decades. Today, Japan spends 50% more per capita, and West Germany 1/3 more than we do on research and development. So we're way behind on that. Our schools are getting worse. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, particularly at the elementary and high school level. And even in college, there are less science and engineering Ph.D.s granted in 1985 than there were in 1970. This is not a relative figure. These are absolute numbers of Ph.D.s. We have failed to pursue high-tech breakthroughs that we have been on the edge with, like computer chips, VCRs. We really lost it there. We had the technology before Japan. We let Japan just take it. We haven't even developed high-definition television. That's that HD TV. That's very important for future computer type of spin-offs. We've had a huge increase in defense dollar spending, which is totally indefensible. But it's drained the economic lifeblood out of our country. And lastly, this massive rise in personal and corporate debt has saddled us with huge interest payments. All these mergers that are going on are accompanied by mega debt. And if we ever do have a turnaround or a decline in our the growth of our country or a recession, I think there's going to be a lot of corporations that are going to be very hurting, perhaps even folding. Thought I'd give you a little color here. Notice that's red too. I chose that color on purpose. This is our U.S. trade deficit. This is what's going on. It wasn't too bad until the Reagan years. And then look what happened. It just plummeted, you know. Again, all of these reasons that I just went through are at the bottom of these figures. The bottom line, though, on all of this is we can't compete as well or manufacture higher quality goods than what we can buy abroad. So we import more, well, fewer markets exist for our own goods. So if we can't sell things abroad, we make less money. This is the other thing on military drain on investment. This is one of my favorite graphs because, again, it just shows you very, very clearly what happens to a country that spends too much of its income on the military. It means that there's less, this is percent spent on military of GNP, there's less available for investment for the gross domestic product. So look at who's way over here. The United States, the United Kingdom's over here and stuff like that. There are countries over here that have spent less on military that have spent a lot more on their investment. There's a very sharp correlation here. And of course you all know about the Reagan buildup there. Again, the figures are incredible. Just to give you a brief idea of how expensive these gifts are to the Pentagon, though. $1 billion spent on guided missiles creates 21,000 jobs. I'm not going to argue that they don't create jobs, but if we took the same amount of money, $1 billion, and spent it in education, that would yield 71,000 jobs. So 21,000 versus 71,000 in education. Defense is very, very high tech and very capital intensive. It's doesn't, you know, roll out a lot of jobs. But there's other reasons why we shouldn't spend as much on defense. Obviously, for all the money we spend on defense, we have less available for consumption here at home for a lot of goodies. For every $100 spent on the military, there is $16 less for consumer durables like cars and appliances. There is $11 less for producer durables like machines and equipment for factories, and there's $11 less for homes. The more we spend on defense, the less we have for our infrastructure and for our own needs. How does this translate? All of these factors, they're beginning to build up a picture, I hope, here. As our economy has deteriorated, it's going to come as no surprise that poverty is once again on the rise. Now, poverty, by the definition based on the government, is based on the cost of food basket and then multiplied times 3. Now, this food basket is for emergency use only, so I see Bill here, Bill Anderson, you might want to comment later on more of the intricacies involved there, but what I'm trying to say here is the poverty cutoff points are low to begin with. They're unrealistic. And so when we talk about poverty in America, we mean poor. Well, what does it translate to? In 1987, it's also, by the way, factored in for the age of the person, whether they live in an urban or rural environment, because it costs more in urban areas, and how many people there are in the family. In 1987, for an elderly person, 65 or over, living alone, the minimum poverty cutoff was $5,447. In other words, if a person, say a woman, were living alone on a farm and was making $5,500, she wouldn't be poor. And the same thing for an urban family. Let's see, for an urban family of 9, the poverty cutoff was $23,015. For a family, average family of 4, it's $11,611. Can you imagine surviving for a year with 4 people in a family in an urban area on $11,600? So they are very low. We did have progress made, and you can see this in the graph here for just about everybody in terms of reducing poverty through the 1960s. There's been a conservative attack on poverty programs, Charles Murray and Losing Ground, etc. All this research I've seen since then has disproven his thesis. The war on poverty did work. It didn't work as well as, say, I would have liked to have seen it, but it certainly did show a drop in poverty. But again, since Reagan came into power, and I have to be honest here, a few years before he came into power, it got worse under his presidency. There was a sharp rise in poverty, specifically since 1983. By 1987, 33 million people in the United States were poor. That's 1 out of every 8 people. Between the last decade, the number of poor increased at 3 times the rate of population growth. Our statistics show that the poor are now actually worse off as well. They're further below the poverty line than they've ever been. And at this same time, recall also we've cut our safety net. There's less unemployment insurance. AFDC benefits have been cut by 1/3 over the last 10 years. Remember, this was the administration that gave us ketchup as a vegetable, you know. A lot of that stuff was going on with the school lunch program. Wherever they could cut, they did. Where are they at? Well, despite the claims that the South has been growing more affluent, you can see that southern states have this as an ongoing problem. South Dakota, by the way, is always one that shows up too. South Dakota is a very poor state. Kind of rivals Mississippi almost in those terms. I don't have I can't comment on a regional distribution of that. There's a whole chapter in my book on that. I think it's real interesting though. What's behind the growth of poverty? Well, again, I don't have to comment too much on this either. Voodoo economics, that was George Bush's term, rewarded the rich with tax cuts. Higher military spending meant less dollars for welfare and social safety net. Tighter eligibility and reams of red tape to qualify for poverty programs. In a lot of locales, to qualify for food stamps, you have to fill out a 13-page questionnaire form. Can you imagine if you're illiterate or functionally illiterate trying to do something like that? Cuts in school lunch programs, etc. Court attacks and affirmative action civil rights programs. Continually high unemployment rates, particularly in 1982, deindustrialization, loss of manufacturing jobs, and then I conclude that that anti-poverty programs really did work much against what Murray found. This gives you a rundown on poverty. The number of poor people in the U.S. now equals 1965 level. I made those comments as well. This one also came out very recently. This is came out in a book called The Vulnerable by the Urban Institute, and they compared us to 7 other industrial nations on how we took care of our elderly and our children, and we came out at the bottom of all the 7 countries on that. We have a higher percent of poor children, very much dramatically higher than all the other 7 industrial nations. Reagan's war on welfare pushed 9 million more persons into poverty, and I think a direct result of this is increasing homelessness. That figure of 600,000, by the way, is a conservative figure. We don't know how many there are. That is the low end, I would say. But of that 600,000, 100,000 of them are children. 1 in 3 only get a meal a day. The income is dismally low. $64 per month for a person that's homeless. Not children I'm talking about, just an adult person. But 1 in 3 of the homeless only gets 1 meal a day. How about us? We're not homeless, for the most part. How about the middle class? Well, as poverty has increased, income for most Americans has also taken a nosedive. It reached its peak in 1973, and real average earnings since then fell by 18%, almost 20%, through November of 1988. The average American worker is actually worse off today than 20 years ago in terms of real earnings. Today's typical worker earns about the same pay as in 1961. That is when you take all the inflation out. We're not any better off than we were since 1961. And that shows it pretty graphically. We're right here were the good days, and we began our decline once again. How about hourly pay? What's happened to the pay packet of the average American worker relative to the global economy? Again, there's disaster here. This is the quickest turnaround I've ever seen. This, by the way, comes to us by way of the Wall Street Journal, which is quite willing to comment on this deterioration. All real wages have increased in major industrial countries, yet the U.S. slipped badly in comparison to just about all of our competitors. In 1985, we were way ahead of the peak at $13 an hour, okay? In only 3 years, we slipped to 5th place of all these other countries. West Germany now leads on hourly pay of production workers at $20, while the U.S. is at $13.62. We're barely ahead of Britain at $11 and only one step from the seller. That happened in 3 years. 3 years. So rarely, I think, in the economic history of nations has the tables turned so quickly. There is one bright figure here I'm going to give you. Okay. For the most part, the fall in pay has set in for all races, but particularly for males. In 1973, the median male increase. The median male income in 1987 was $20,603. In 1987, 14 years later, it was $17,750. These are constant dollars with inflation subtracted, and this is in 1987 dollars. So we went from 20,600 in 1973 down to 17,750 in 1987. That was a drop of 14% in real median male income. That comes to $190 per hour, which might seem small to you, but this rate of income loss would sustain at least 250 million people in the world's 9 poorest countries for each of the past 15 years. The rate would. That's a lot of money, somewhere. There is some good news to these figures, though. I don't know if you can see it from the graph here. For real income has continued to increase for women. It's been on an unbroken climb, and it increased 13% in real dollars from 1973 to 87. They have been the only group that I've seen where there hasn't been a deterioration or a decline. They gained $950 in real dollars over the last 15 years, which comes to $63 a year. Although nice, I think this is great. It doesn't offset the loss for males. The net result, oftentimes, at least in families, is again net income loss. I realize it's hot, and I only have a few more of these, so I'm going to try to hurry this up a little bit. Real income for families did go up sharply after World War II, but it petered out by 1973. There's been a long-term dip from 73 to 87. For every year since that time until the last year I had available, 1987, there was less income earned. And you can see this again by this figure here. By the way, I don't know if you can lost my pointer. There it is. This is for whites. This is green is for whites, yellow is for Hispanic, and red is for black. When you trendline the data from 1972 through 1986, 87, it's on a continuous decline here. And you can see it here as well. It's been up and down, but for the most part, down. The racial gap has also grown between whites and blacks. In constant dollars, white families had an income 78% larger than black families as of 1986, but in 1970 that ratio was 63%. So there's growth again in real differences in income between blacks and whites. Who are the ones losing income? Generally us. Overall, 18% loss by 1989 between 73 is the peak year anyway. And like I mentioned, in real earnings, we're back to 1961. The loss of earnings is common among nearly all occupations, except teachers, by the way. That intrigued me. You might want to comment on that later. There has been a few top jobs created in business and finance at the top, but that is offset by many, many low-income service-related jobs, hamburger flippers and whatnot. So there's been kind of a bifurcation occurring in their occupational spectrum. And again, income decline is evident for every age and race cohort, but is most severe for young white males. And by the way, I don't mean to detract from the feminization of poverty. What we're talking about here, though, is white males that are losing income rather than going into poverty necessarily. And the point is they don't have these high-paying manufacturing jobs anymore to step into. The Midwest has been the real loser. The data on this is incredible. Removing inflation, the richest fifth of families gained 15% real income, while the poorest fifth lost 8% over the last 15 years. And this is what it looks like over time. Notice here that in 1947, this is median family income, and it did increase again up to 73, and then it kind of went down for the most part. But this is the income of the highest fifth of families, I think I got here. Yeah, and the lowest fifth. And notice this, that there's been not that much increase for the poorest fifth of families, but there's been astronomical increase for the largest fifth. So over time, it's like the thing yawns very wide for our population. We've been talking about absolute income here. I'm almost done here. I've got a few more. There's been a surge in relative income inequality as well. The family Gini score dropped 7.5% in 20 years. That was between 1947 and 67 to 0.348 in the U.S. But since 1968, it's been on the rise, and it reached its record, according to my last data, in 1986 at 0.392. And at that point, family income inequality, the relative income inequality, was greater than at any time in the past 40 years in the United States. Most of this rise occurred under the Reagan presidency. There was a rise of, let's see, 5% between 1968 and 79, but between 1980 and 86, there was another rise of 7.5%. And as you can see, this occurred for blacks as well as whites. And again, with the exception of women, it's been increasing. And even there, the evidence on relative income inequality showing that women are also starting to increase now. This is a real dramatic graph here too, I think, because this takes the richest 5% and the amount of money they're getting. So back in 1960, the richest 5% were getting 17% of all the money, the richest 5% of families. They went down quite a bit during the 70s. Look at that. By 1979, 1980, they were getting a little more than 15%. And then again, in the 80s, we hit this huge increase for the richest 5%, whereas what happens to the poorest 40%, they did very well during the 60s and even into the 70s, but they started a long decline. The trends have reversed for the polar extremes once again. The saddest point of all here to the data is that the change has been even sharper for families with children. This gets back to the feminization of poverty, because I think this data reflects the greater poverty of female-headed families. And this is, again, relative income inequality here. We're dealing with Gini ratios. This is a percent going to each fifth. And as you see over the 14, 15-year period here, the poorest fifth of families with children lost about a third of their income relatively. And the richest families with kids gained 10%. Again, that's relative income here with Gini ratios. I have some absolute income figures here, and also the last graph. much as 5% of families with kids receive 17% of all income in 1984, and that has not been that large since 1952. The poorest fifth lost 2,834 real dollars in the span from 1973 to 87. Two-thirds of that loss happened under the Reagan presidency. In essence, you know, whether you look at real income or relative income, there's been decline. There's been decline globally. There's been decline nationally. There's been decline for all races, and I almost hesitate to say this, but not for sexes, but I do think that, again, relative income inequality is probably going to start increasing for women as well. I'd love to address, well, what can we do about this? I don't have the time. In fact, I probably kept you a little too long, but I'll close with that. Thank you.
First, I want to deal with some problems that involves the selection and collection of data on income distribution. And secondly, I want to make a few suggestions which I think might make the case against the unequal distribution of income even more persuasive. Dealing with the first area, you always have a great difficulty of dealing with what kind of statistics you're going to use. And my criticism, if you want to call it that, is not because I've got a better suggestion than what Denny has used, but he's used the so-called gross national product figures. And there are lots of problems with that gross national product. I think the first thing that you've got to bear in mind that the United States has, quote, the best collection system that you're going to find any place in the world. Most of the rest of the world does a really elementary job of trying to collect anything in the way of gross national product figures. And so that makes it extremely difficult to identify what you mean by poor nations and rich nations and et cetera, because they don't necessarily measure or collect information on the same thing. One of the difficulties you've got, and this is particularly true with respect to the gross national product figures, is you've got to bear in mind that we only collect data on things that go through a market, that involve exchange between a couple of parties, whether it happens to be a corporation or a couple of individuals. Doesn't make any difference. And that gives you some of the difficulty in particularly the poorer nations, because they have not reached the stage that we have in terms of the kind of products they buy. For example, we go off to shop for food items, and you go to the meat department and you find here is a roast or a steak or a pork chop, and it's all wrapped up in a lot of plastic. You're not going to find that in most of the rest of the world. If they have any meat at all, it's probably still going to be hanging on a hook someplace, and if you do order some, they'll go whack off a piece. You can't really compare them. And I'm just using that as an illustration of the problem. Now, let me put that into the perspective here of income distribution. I think that probably means that in the poorer countries, if you were to try and count the same kind of things that are counted, say, in the United States or Britain or Germany or Japan, because they're much more similar to us, it is that the statistics would show that the lower income people would probably have somewhat higher incomes if we did try to count those things. Now, the other, and it's a closely related item to that, is the problem of what you count in another sense. Most of the time when we put together the national income statistics, there's a great deal of income that doesn't necessarily get counted because people are not required to report it as income. Now, for example, a great many of those executives that Denny showed you a chart on, he indicated that that included some of what you might call fringe benefits, but I'm willing to wager it didn't include a lot of other fringe benefits. The General Motors president doesn't own an automobile. He doesn't need to, because anytime he needs to go someplace, he's going to be chauffeur-driven in a company car. And that doesn't show up as income. And in this country, I think if you did that, you'd probably find that the income distribution picture is much more unequal than the actual figures that Denny showed. One of the problems I would suggest is that even with the census figures, now I filled out my census figures, and I put in the same income that I reported to the IRS. You know, let me just make it very clear. The Peterson family income is in the top 5%. Most of that income that puts us in that top 5% is not taxable. And you can be sure I didn't tell the census about that. I would suggest to you everybody else that's in the top 5 or 10% behaves the same way. And as a consequence, you know, I think if you could get those numbers, the income distribution picture would look even more unequal than it is. Now, let me just move to a few items that I want to discuss with respect to the some suggestions. You know, Denny didn't bring this up in the lecture, but he discussed the so-called incentive argument, and this is dealing a little more with what you might or might not be able to do about the income, I suppose, and that's probably why he didn't get around to mentioning that today. There are a number of things that I think are wrong with the so-called incentive argument. One of them is that it completely ignores the fact that if you're in that bottom area and your family has been mired there for generation after generation, there's probably a big disincentive effect, and they completely ignore that when it comes to looking at the income distribution picture. The usual argument is that you need some unequal distribution. And I'm using the term equal or unequal and not talking about whether something is equitable. That's a different story, I would assume. The usual argument is that if you cut the taxes for the rich, and the way we really cut the taxes is in terms of excluding from taxation large parts of income. You know, that's one of the problems I think the American people have never really come to understand. That changing the rate structure doesn't make any difference, really. If you go back and look at the income that was taxed before this latest tax cut, before the Reagan tax cuts, you will discover that the actual rate that the upper income groups paid peaked out at about 35%, even though supposedly the so-called progressive rate kept going up to 70%. And I can remember the day when it went to 91. But it never went to 91 for anyone, because we had excluded from taxation large amounts of income. So you can be very rich in terms of the amount of income you get, but it's not recognized and taxable income. Now, I think that's one of the problems that we deal with. On the other hand, as I said, we completely avoid the disincentives. And I think one of the problems you've got with the disincentive approach is that this may well lead to a lot of bad things that happen in a society. A group of people that are mired at the bottom, engage in criminal activity of one kind or some way or another, vent their feelings about the disaster in which they're dealing. And then our usual response is that, boy, we'd better hire some more police so we can get out here and cause those people to be legal and obedient, etc. And as a general rule, it doesn't do a bit of good. Let me take up one other thing here. You know, Denny sort of glossed over this in his report, and he didn't come up with it. If you take a look at the percentage of income that comes from wealth, it's a much bigger factor than I think Denny spent time on. The upper income groups in this society tend to get a rather high amount of their income, whether it's taxed or not, and most of it tends not to be taxed, from inheritance. The whole system tends to build up. Now, there's this old myth that the one generation makes the wealth and the next generation spends it. Well, that's a bunch of crap. That's not the way it happens. The wealth just continues to get more and more concentrated in the hands of a smaller and smaller group. And I think that should have been emphasized a little more in terms of making the argument against the inequality of income. It of course, ventures into an area that economists long ago decided they weren't going to have anything to do with, and that is the whole matter of distribution. You know, Karl Marx raised the question about the fairness of the distribution system. And so economists decided that the best answer to Karl Marx was to get away from distribution completely and to get started on what it was that created value. That was a nice technique to not have to involve oneself in the discussion about income distribution or any other part of the distribution question. Now, I think the wealth attitude has another aspect here that ought to be emphasized. There is some implication by a good many individuals, whether they're economists or not, that you have to have that unequal in order to get the amount of investment in new plant and new equipment. Part of the rationale of the Reagan administration was that you lowered the taxes on the upper income groups, and then those groups are going to go out and invest. And I'm using invest in the usual economic term to mean the putting in place of real capital goods that are going to be used in the process of producing more goods in the future. You know, there is absolutely no indication that the upper income groups do that. If you compare one group, let's say you have two individuals, you know, one with $1 million a year income and one with $5,000 a year income, and you give the two of them, let's say, another $1,000 or whatever. The indications are that the percentage of that income which will be consumed is going to be identical between the two groups. Now, they won't consume the same thing. The wealthy individual will go off and buy more expensive French wine, pay more for their call girls or whatever, and they'll buy a whole different kind of thing, which we then assume. Now, that's part of the reason I would suggest to you that we've had this increasing amount of balance of trade problems in the United States. The rich have been going off. They take longer trips running around the world, enjoying themselves, but they do not go out and put more into capital goods. The truth of the matter is that right now the capital goods are coming from the corporations. You've heard all this bit about how the saving rate in the United States has gone down. And it has among individuals. But it's being offset for the most part by a huge increase in the amount of saving by corporations. And then those corporations go off and buy plant and equipment, not necessarily in the United States, but in some other country, and primarily they're doing it because they have a better opportunity to exploit labor in those areas. I was in China. I saw evidence of this all over the place. I went through a big wire producing factory, virtually completely automated, that had been built by Japanese and American capitalists. There was only one reason they chose that country instead of building it. Well, there might have been two. But the main one was they were paying 5 yen a day for the labor in that factory. That's about $1.50. And if they had built the thing in this country or in Japan, they would have had to have paid a great deal more. Now, there is another reason why they did it. The pollution to the environment that was being emitted by that plant, the Chinese were so anxious to have that plant there that they didn't pay any attention at all to the damage it was doing to the environment, which is something else I think that should be emphasized. I want to comment on one last thing. I'm not sure that this is fair to Denny. As I read through the material, you know, I sort of got the idea that he might have been a believer that economic growth could solve a lot of the world's problems in this area. And yet, as he pointed out, when you took a look at the areas where there had been growth, the income inequalities got worse. I would just point out that I think economic growth cannot be used as the solution. In fact, I would suggest to you that what it's done more than anything else is to allow us to exploit the Earth's non-renewable resources at an ever-increasing rate. And it has allowed us to produce more goods in the short run, which unfortunately has caused the world's population to speed up something terrible, and it means in the long run, as far as I'm concerned, that you're going to have more and more starvation in the world. There aren't enough non-renewable resources for every society in the world to create the kind of industrial model that we have in this country, and yet that's what we keep going out, and that's what the World Bank preaches. You ought to copy what's been going on in the United States. Frankly, I think on this we will agree, Denny, that is not going to provide the kind of answers to the problems that exist in the world.
When you think about something that I thought about and have absolutely no expertise to deal with, what if we think of this as, what if we really do think of this as a world economy in which the investments from one country go to another and that shifts around, which it has historically. You know, this country is invested in other countries and other countries are now investing in this country. What happens if we actually think about this as a world economy? I think the last, what you were saying at the end, is probably I don't even want to talk about it, but but if we think about that and see it not as the United States or core or periphery, you know, are those semantics and definitions? Would it be possible to see this as a whole system that works even?
Dale, you may have a different perspective because you are the economist, sir, but my reaction to that would be that the money doesn't disappear. It does get transferred to another area, but I think what happens when it does get transferred, as in development, for example, that it leaves, it concentrates among fewer actors, essentially. So you get elites, you might get a highly paid, sophisticated, skilled labor force, but very small in a third world country, whereas you get, you know, an eroding manufacturing labor force in the United States or elsewhere. So that's how I would see that happening. The income actually doesn't disappear, the money, but it gets more concentrated. You might have a
sort of spirals into it.
Well, I wouldn't basically disagree. I personally don't think that you're going to be able to avoid the idea that it is a one-world economy, that the non-renewable resources of the world are finite. Whether you like to recognize it or not, the fact remains that we are now importing into this country better than half of the 16 major non-renewable resources that we use. 15 of them we are buying more than half of our total from outside. And that's just going to increase. I don't care whether you're talking about the United States or any place else. My suggestion would probably be that I think that what you call the core countries are going to have the biggest problems making the adjustment to a world.
I guess you had your hand up first.
I didn't have the benefit of reading your book yet, so my comments will be limited to what I saw here in the board and your comments on those things. About income inequality, I suppose there are always two aspects here. One that you are concerned about a little bit more, and that is the equality part of it, and economists get concerned about the efficiency part of it also. Because we want to reward people, some are going to be a little bit more better off than the others. So somehow that concern I thought was not brought up. The efficiency, what in economics is called the efficiency aspect of it. And then there's another related thing, and that is true that whether we look in terms of the Gini coefficients or the Lorenz curves there, over a period of time, the income equality or inequality for a fairly long period of time remained somewhat constant. And then in the last few years, it has gone up a little bit. But there is another aspect there, and that is the poorest 20%, people who were the poorest 20%, say in 1970, are not the poorest 20% in 1980. So there's a lot of shifts that are going on. The richest 20% are not the richest in 80, who were also the richest in 1970. There's a constant, there's a flux there. As we look at the cross-sectional data there, that cannot bring it out. Year after year, we look at the cross-section data and we think it's the same people who are rich and poor. We are permanently locked into poverty or affluence. The data, as you look at the time series data, it doesn't show that. There is a movement from the bottom to the top, and from the top to the bottom, and in between. Second is, the core country, the semi-periphery and the periphery countries. I don't know how much of an operational concept that would be. Putting Norway in the semi-periphery and New Zealand in the complete periphery outside there. I know that they depend on some sort of criteria that they use, but operationally, I don't know how much useful that sort of classification would be. And in particular, you saw the chart there that as the penetration increased, the inequalities also increased there. But that scatter diagram seemed to be fairly random, so I wish you compute an R there and see if the R is significant also at the same time. I wouldn't be surprised if the R particularly if you standardize for some of the, as you look at those things, standardize some of the quite a few variables. And then of course this idea is carried further into quite a bit of more analysis there. But if the basic idea had some weaknesses in there, the subsequent analysis would also suffer to that extent. I think at this time, this is what I would say. If I had the end.
Replying to your points, I agree with most of them. And particularly, I like the idea of having longitudinal data. And we do know, for example, that the actors amongst the poverty population does change quite a bit. And so in a sense, that makes the figures even worse because whereas what they say 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 6 is under poverty, but when you count the people that go into and out of poverty and start counting those over a year or two, it increases substantially. So I would agree. I think that the poorest will vary through time, and I think that would be worse. I'm more hesitant to agree with the fact that some of the richest actors would change, or the richest. Maybe with the 20%, I would agree with that. But if we took the top 5%,
there is a study actually which says that the 20% who were the richest in '68, out of them, not everybody. If you look at, say, there were 20 million people, not all the same 20 million were the richest in 1980. Some of them, in fact, had moved down because of whatever reasons. So it that again, the University of Michigan study.
Oh, a panel study. Okay. The other thing I would say is that, and you don't have any way of knowing this, but I did do a multiple regression using all these penetration variables and a lot of the other variables. And penetration did come out as a major predictor of income inequality on the regressions. Janet, you hear me?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for really interesting.
Oh, thanks.
I was thinking as you were talking, I'm having problems with your emphasis on relative income inequality, as opposed to real income, which is where most people actually live their lives, what it really means to be poor. And what I hear you saying is looking or suggesting the redistribution of wealth globally and in the United States. And I'm wondering how the emphasis on income decline within certain groups may detract from the real message, which is who are poor. So when you you talk about white males relatively losing income, more than appropriate statement, but in terms of the whole, it seems like we need to emphasize who really are the poor. And when you start going into those global figures, those United Nations figures that say women do 2/3 of the world's work, which is another problem with the gross national product, because it doesn't take into account the work that women do, especially the unpaid labor that women do outside the home, inside the home and outside in developing countries. But it seems like women do 2/3 of the world's work. What is it? They earn 1/10 of the world's income, and they own less than 1% of the world's wealth. That is an incredible statistic for the whole area of inequality. And I'd like to see a more visible presence about who the poor are. You had the graphs of poor by race. It would have been real interesting with the U.S. poverty rates by gender to have done the one by gender. And you mentioned feminization of poverty in there, which is real good and real appropriate. But when we're really talking about who the poor people are, I'd like to have seen a more real basic emphasis who the poor are.
Yeah, your points are well taken. I think particularly if I ever do a revised edition of this, I want to particularly address the global nature of women in the workforce, because I do think that they're victimized, particularly globally. We're still just starting to get some real good studies on that now.
Denny, I think you've painted a very alarming picture here, which we're all very appreciative of. I think what we're analyzing here a little bit is brushstrokes, so if you don't mind me just commenting on one aspect as a geographer, I was a little alarmed at the types of projections you used to show the global statistics. The picture that you used was a Mercator-type projection, which was showing Greenland to be 5 times the size of South America, and you're wanting to paint a picture to it. So I would suggest that that's a very serious problem that has to be faced in one glance of anybody reading that book.
That's a good point. I have to plead
I
limitations
understand.
of my software, but yeah, yeah, that is a good point.
Yeah, talk about poverty. When you talk about poverty, I saw a graph, Denny, where there's so many people bunched right above the poverty level that if the income was raised another, or lowered another 1,000, or raised another, several million more people will drop down into that. And I don't think people know how many people are really just right above that poverty. Like if it's set at 10.6, there's a lot of women making 10.8.
Yeah.
They're just close to it.
Yeah. That's a good point. And the Census Bureau publishes data. They used to. I don't know if they're going to do it this year, but people within 150% of the poverty range and this and that. And when you start looking at that, and that's pretty close, pretty darn close, the figures are much worse. Well, I think
several million people.
Yeah. Rosemary.
I just have a question. Is this as bad as it's ever been? I mean, you've looked at 15 years. I mean, if you look back historically, do these patterns like come and go, or or is this as bad as it's likely to be?
Oh, I think Dale or somebody mentioned that the Gini ratio has been very stable over years, and there's a Professor Solto from University of Wisconsin that did a study of Wisconsin for 100 years, and he found that the Gini ratio almost didn't change at all, barely budged. And other studies have shown that too. Generally, when it does change, it generally changes very glacially, but the amount of change, I think, is very high for what's in a historical context. It's very, very high. Dale, you want to—
Well, there are two things that I wanted to mention. One, I know that if you look at the income distribution between 1900 and 1965, that it stayed almost constant between those two times. And there has been a sizable change towards more going to the upper income group since 65. There's one other, I made comments criticizing the use of GNP. In a sense, this isn't a lot better. But I think for the United States, it might make some sense if you use the disposable income. In other words, if you take the income that actually is available for individuals to be spending, which currently is something like $3.7 trillion, and divide it by the population. You come out with a per capita disposable income. I remind you, this is after you've paid all taxes, of about $13,000 per individual. Which means that I'm just going to pick one because I remember it. If you took a family of 4, and that would make no difference whether it are adults or children, times 13,000, you end up with 52,000 after tax income. Well, the average family of 4 has about 10.6, which I think tells you you've got a distribution problem. You don't necessarily have a quantity problem.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the Midwest did poorly due to decline of industry. I wonder now if we have decline of defense spending, whether such thing will harm East Coast and West Coast, and maybe relatively help to the Midwest economy, because the Midwest didn't get much money out of defense pie. What do you think in the years ahead with defense spending reduction?
I think relatively we'll probably do better. I think the South is already suffering because of the decline in energy prices and the, coming decline in defense spending. The South is, it's been called the gun belt of the U.S. There's so many bases down here. So I think in that respect, relatively, we're going to be okay. But the deindustrialization has already taken place, a lot of it, so that we're probably never going to get those jobs back. So I don't see us increasing, in terms of actual wealth but I see relatively perhaps the decrease is going to be lessened or possibly even stopped. By the way, I wanted to tell you about a great book on deindustrialization, and particularly in relation to the Midwest. It's by Bennett Harrison and Gary Bluestone. It's called The Great U-Turn. And some of you might have read it, be familiar with it, but it's just a real good one. Yeah.
And of all the graphs I saw, the one that it really surprised me was the wages of the increase in wages, notably in West Germany. Yeah. Over a 3-year period of time, what that graph was showing, if I remember right, was wages in West Germany virtually doubled for production workers in 3 years. That, can anybody explain that for me? I'm really find that surprising.
I would think that the exchange rate
probably did that.
Okay.
During those 3 years. The exchange rate fluctuates a lot more than anything else.
So in essence, in terms of basket of goods and stuff, their wages in '86 were really a lot better than that showed there.
Sure.
So
the dollar decline about a third of its value in 1 year or something like that. It's real dramatic.
Yeah.
Yeah, Braun.
You and Dale mentioned that there is so much pressure on the natural resources, and if everybody, especially Dale emphasized, everybody consumes as much as we do, the earth is kaput. Now, the question is, you want to comment how we can reduce that negative role model. I mean, for us, everybody wants to live better, bigger houses, bigger whatever. Big TV is necessity, everything is necessity. And the rest of the crew, special upper classes, follow. And the tax that people, exploit that people. Who set the tone in this country for that negative value system?
How can we fix it? That's a big question.
Upper 20% rich
Next book, volume 2, right?
I do have a full ending chapter on this. The only thing briefly I'm going to comment on that is I do think that part of it is imagery, and somehow we got to unplug from the consumer society and get people to thinking about basic values once again. It's just like we feel like if we don't have our BMW, we're going to have an unhappy life. There's a lot of people that believe that crap. Yeah.
Very quick comment. The environment went kaput in Romania and East Turkey, where the living standards are low, not high. So keep that in mind.
And they should live modestly and sell to us or give away their
That means
be happy.
Low standard of living is no guarantee for good environment.
Depending on, well, I think the example that Dale gave of the Chinese factory is a good one too. Although China, I think, we give them credit, they've had real good GNP growth per person, and better distribution. So. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.